Basically, right as I walked into that main briefing room was when the live video showed the second plane hitting the second tower.
So when he came back the second time after the second aircraft, he said, another aircraft hit the second World Trade Center. It was on purpose.
And we saw the second airplane hit. I said, I think everybody in the room knows we were under some kind of an attack. And we're going to be called upon, and we're going to be called upon early, and it's going to last a long time.
His first call was to maintenance, and he told them to load the jets. And he said, find whatever missiles you can, get as many missiles on as many jets as you can.
So as we're descending, I think past 20,000 feet, they said, guys, it's a terrorist, second tower has been hit, it's a terrorist attack. At that time, I was flying the aircraft, and I just literally pushed the power off. Just simultaneously, I'm like, terrorist attack. I said, guys, there's a terrorist attack. We're got to do our job.
So SAS was going to fly his jet into the cockpit of the airliner, and I would fly my jet into the tail, into the empennage, and take off that back half of the airliner.
"20 years ago tomorrow, Americans everywhere were pulled from their normal routines to watch news of an accident in New York. And then, with news cameras pointed from all angles at the World Trade Center with the North Tower aflame, we watched in shock as United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the second tower. Not since Pearl Harbor has a singular moment had such an emotional impact that it reshaped Americans' view of the world and altered the course of human events. For those of us in the armed forces, we knew at that moment that we were at war, or soon would be. I'm Justin Wheeland, the host of Seeking Context, broadcasting live from Oakley, Kansas. This is the story of 7 service members and their experience from a time before and after the world changed. 20 years ago today, the aviators you just saw were like all Americans going about business as usual. They lived in the world of September 10th, a time before everything changed for all of us. Before hearing about the events of the next day, I'd like to take you back to the time of September 10th, 2001. It was a typical day in a world that may seem hard to remember for those of us alive at the time, and hard to comprehend for the generation of young Americans that has grown up with 9/11 as something they read about in a history book, rather than a current event. For Americans, it was a time of relative peace and prosperity. The Cold War with Russia had ended. Those entering the armed forces and military service academies studied Gulf War I, at the time known as the Persian Gulf War, with a military campaign led by General Norman Schwarzkopf and a famous air campaign orchestrated by Lieutenant General Chuck Horner. Saddam Hussein was still in power, but we had successfully pushed his forces out of Kuwait, and the Air Force was now enforcing a no-fly zone over the northern and southern territories of his country, ensuring that Iraq would no longer threaten its neighbors. The U.S. military supported limited operations in other parts of the world, but by and large, it felt like we were in a period of peace that very well might endure. Texas Governor George W. Bush had narrowly defeated Vice President Al Gore by a margin of just 537 votes to become president, an outcome that was hotly debated with much hand-wringing over those hanging chads, the incomplete ballots that could have swung the election one way or the other, depending on how they were counted. On September 10th, 2001, President George W. Bush was in his 7th month of his first term as president of the United States. The economy was fairly strong. For the year-end 2000, the U.S. ran a surplus. You heard that right. It was a surplus of $236 billion. Cell phones were gaining popularity, but were still kind of a luxury for most consumers. And cell phones with cameras were not a thing, or they at least were not widely adopted until about 2003. The iPhone wouldn't be invented until many years later. And do you recall trips to the airport? We would park and then go inside and go through the metal detectors with our shoes on to the gate to meet loved ones holding up the little sign, welcoming them back from wherever they were. The Transportation Security Agency, the TSA, didn't exist. It wasn't invented or established until November of 2001. And on top of that, you all looked amazing. I've been checking out pictures from that time, and truly everyone looks about 20 years younger. So it wasn't a problem-free world by any stretch, but it really was a different time. If you have memories of that time, whether it's a reflection on the way the world was on September 10th or a story of your own experience on 9/11, we'd love to hear about your story to help put the events of that time in context. Please feel free to join the conversation on our Facebook page, YouTube, or Twitch, or visit us at seekingcontext.com. Our story begins 20 years ago today. It was the world of September 10th in the heartland at Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma. Tinker Air Force Base, just outside of Oklahoma City, is home of the Airborne Warning and Control System, commonly known as AWACS. AWACS is a surveillance aircraft, sometimes referred to as the eyes in the sky. It is a modified Boeing 707 with a large dome, roughly 30 feet in diameter, that sits atop the fuselage, which houses a powerful radar capable of detecting, identifying, and tracking any aircraft within 200 miles. In the cockpit of the AWACS sits a crew of a pilot, navigator, and a flight engineer. In the back of the aircraft is a crew of personnel who operate the radar and communicate with fighter aircraft to help them identify, target, and if necessary, fire upon enemy targets. In essence, the AWACS is a flying air traffic control station designed to provide command and control of a wartime battle space. On September 10th, 2001, the crew of an AWACS with call sign Century 40 were planning a 4-day training mission to Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina. Staff Sergeant Scott Lindholm describes his role as a flight engineer.
I always tell people, you ever see the movie The Airplane? You've got the two guys up front, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is sitting in the right seat, and then the guy behind him, he's the flight engineer.
That's you.
So you're in charge of all the systems, air conditioning. It's all done by computers now, of course. It's air conditioning, hydraulics, the fuel, the electrical system. We ran all the checklists. Of course, the aircraft commander, Jeff was in charge, but he'd say, "Hey, Andrew, run the checklist. Do this checklist. And we run the checklist. Flip all the switches." And make sure things got done. So that's it. And then we also pre-flight the plane, post-flight the plane. Take care of any any maintenance issues. If we can handle a minor maintenance issue, we'll do it. But yeah,
right.
We're pretty much aircraft commander's right-hand guy.
Scott goes on to describe the crew's various activities on September 10th as they prepared for their 4-day mission from Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma to Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina.
Oh yeah, September 10th. It was just typical mission planning. It's all day affair, and it probably was even more so because we were planning on going TDY to Shaw Air Force Base for a few days. So it was more of as a flight engineer, find out who the maintenance guys were. We had some security forces coming with us. What they're planning on taking. Are they extra toolboxes, extra parts? Because we're responsible for the weight and balance of the plane too. So. We had to coordinate all that, tell people, okay, this is the limit on luggage. We're not a cargo plane. There's a very small cargo compartment back there. So, just things like that. Pretty standard, really. Nothing crazy. And
the pilot of Scott's aircraft, Captain Jeff Van Dusen, had recently completed an upgrade to become a mission commander in the AWACS, which meant he was now qualified to be the pilot in command of an AWACS mission without outside supervision.
But this was the first aircraft where I was in charge, and I was on the orders as the sole acting commander for the airplane. And we were planning a 4-day trip to Shaw Air Force Base to work on the East Coast, to work BFM maneuvers or fighter maneuvers for some of the fighters. We actually had 37 people. So we had two pilots, 2 engineers, 2 navigators. Actually, I think it was just 1. And we had, the rest was ABMs and our guys in the back. And then we had about 6 maintenance and security officers, because they were our protection element every time we land, so they can bed down the aircraft.
The aircraft that Jeff and Scott were flying was one of 37 AWACS under the command of General Ben T. Robinson. General Robinson, a former Army helicopter pilot who served in Vietnam and later joined the Air Force, first flew AWACS in 1980. After rising to various leadership positions in the AWACS community and Air Force Space Command, General Robinson was the wing commander of the 552nd Air Control Wing, responsible for the training, maintenance, and operations of AWACS airmen at the aircraft's home base in Oklahoma, and operations of those aircraft deployed around the world. Airmen under General Robinson's command were supporting Operation Southern Watch in Saudi Arabia, Operation Northern Watch in Turkey, and counter-drug operations in South America. General Robinson recalls the rhythm of his day as wing commander on September 10th.
Because the 10th was on a Monday, my secretary, who was magnificent, my chief of staff, and my exec, we would all sit around the table in my office and kind of go over the week. And make sure that we knew what I was supposed to be doing, what was the big thing, that those visitors coming, how to set that up, who was in charge of that. And then at 9 o'clock, most wings have stand up in the afternoon. We had ours at 9 o'clock. And because of AWACS, we had operations in Northern Southern Watch. We had operations in America. We had Operation Counter. So we would look at, what did we do yesterday? How did those go? What are we doing today, and what are we going to do tomorrow? Mm-hmm. And you're talking about an airplane that's in Saudi, or you're talking about an airplane that's in Turkey, or you're talking about an airplane that's in Aruba in South America with counter drugs, or you're talking about a deployed airplane at Elmworth or Kadena. So it's a big show.
While an AWACS can detect, identify, and track aircraft, it typically works with fighter jets to target and, when necessary, fire upon enemy aircraft. The Air Force F-15C Eagle is an air superiority fighter designed to do just that. At Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, F-15 pilot Cory Bower was expecting a slow week. Many of the pilots in his squadron had just returned from a deployment to Operation Southern Watch in Saudi Arabia, with most on leave for the week.
Yeah, and we were just kind of running a skeleton crew in the 27th Fighter Squadron. So I was probably doing a couple meetings with the OG and that kind of stuff, but just kind of flying 2 or 3 times a week, normal schedule.
Captain Phil Jowler Stodick was an F-15 instructor at Langley, responsible for teaching new F-15 pilots how to properly employ their aircraft and ensuring their skills were up to the standards required for combat operations. Because he was scheduled to instruct a new student on September 11th, Captain Stodick spent time on the 10th preparing for his mission brief the next day.
I had a mission that I was supposed to fly with an MQT student, a mission qualification training student. And right. I was an instructor pilot at the time, but a very new instructor pilot, fairly inexperienced. And so I know that I would have been putting a lot of time into making sure that I had that mission all ready to go and was ready. So I'm sure that
Captain Bower and Captain Stodick served in an active duty Air Force squadron at Langley Air Force Base. 150 miles north at Andrews Air Force Base, the 121st Fighter Squadron was a unit of the District of Columbia Air National Guard flying F-16 fighters. Slightly smaller than the F-15, F-16s are a multi-role aircraft that conduct air-to-air and air-to-ground bombing missions. One of the 121st Fighter Squadron's newest wingmen, Lieutenant Heather "Lucky" Penney, recalls an expected week of light duties as her squadron had just returned from a training exercise in Las Vegas.
And September 10th rolls around. Do you remember what you were doing kind of the day before everything went down?
Laundry. We had just gotten back from Red Flag that previous Saturday, and the boss gave everyone Monday off.
In order for fighter pilots, AWACS airmen, and military personnel of all branches to conduct operations around the world, the Air Force employs a fleet of transport aircraft. The largest aircraft in the Air Force is the C-5 Galaxy. C-5 pilot Bobby Wolf recalls his plans to visit family in Washington, D.C. on September 10th.
So I was stationed in Dover, Delaware. Dover, for the viewers, is one of the largest air mobility bases in the world. I'd probably just come back from a mission. I was spending some time and had a chance to get out to D.C. to do some tourist stuff.
On the morning of September 11th, AWACS pilot Jeff Van Dusen and his flight engineer Scott Lindholm got off to an early start.
Then showed up to work, like I said, me and the technicians, you go into a small briefing first with everybody, and then we're broken off and get on a bus and head out to the flight line and start pre-flighting the plane. And we noticed a fuel gauge malfunction, which we would have typically taken off with, but since we were going TDY, the MEL, the minimum equipment list, stated that if you were going to be off station, you couldn't go off station with a broken fuel gauge. And of course, this is probably 6 a.m. or something. Still, it's early, Central Time at Tinker Air Force Base. So
right.
They come out, they troubleshoot for a little while. They figure they can't fix it, so we bag drag to a different plane. Calling Jeff the whole time, telling him what's going on. Or probably, I don't know, probably didn't have a cell phone at the time, so it's probably relaying through command post. And then we drag over the other plane, get that one going. It doesn't have an auxiliary power unit, which means we're going to need a air cart wherever we go to start the engines. So we're like, oh, no big deal. The maintenance guys aren't happy, but that's fine. So then the rest of the crew shows up. We take off like normal. We're late. We're running late.
While Jeff, Scott, and 35 other members of the crew were preparing to fly, their wing commander, General Robinson, was conducting a staff meeting with leadership from around the base.
Well, that started off, as I mentioned, just a very routine day. That particular day, we have a group called associate commanders, and that's the Air Base Wing Commander. We have a reserve tanker unit. We have a Navy wing at Tinker. We have ACC Mobility Communications Unit. It's a group. We have a Canadian element. So on this particular morning, they're all in my conference room, and we were going to do a wing overview, wing briefing. And then from there, we were all going to go down to stand up and listen to stand up as our guests, so they knew what this AWACS wing was all about. Mm-hmm. And it started at 8 o'clock. Well, just prior to 8 o'clock, Secretary Debbie Urquhart walks in and says there's been a tragedy in New York City. An airliner apparently has run into the World Trade Center. And we go, wow, several of us were pilots, and how in the world could that have happened?
The incident that Secretary Debbie Urquhart reported was American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew. It had departed Boston Logan Airport at 7:59 a.m. bound for Los Angeles. 5 hijackers took control of the aircraft, turned it east, and crashed into the north tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. While morning news shows in New York captured footage of the crash live as it happened, most people in the country assumed it was a terrible accident. At Andrews Air Force Base, Heather Penney's squadron was holding a morning meeting when they first heard reports of the incident.
So we got the news. I mean, we're sitting inside the scheduling meeting, and there's no television, no radios, no nothing like that. And remember, this was before anyone had cell phones. Mm-hmm. People forget we didn't have cell phones. We weren't continuously plugged in. No one was getting news alerts. If you were somebody, you might have had a PDA or a pager, yeah. If you were really important. But so one of our enlisted troops, David Chunks Callahan, he knocks on the door and he interrupts, and we're all like, dude, party foul.
Right. You shouldn't interrupt the meeting, right?
No, you don't interrupt meetings, right? When the door closes, the door's closed. And he says, an airplane just flew into the World Trade Center. And we kind of looked at him, and we looked outside because we had these huge plate glass windows that face the flight line. And we're thinking to ourselves, how does this happen? Because it was a crystal blue day, just spectacularly blue. And so it couldn't have been someone who pooched their instrument approach in LaGuardia. So that clearly wasn't the case. Maybe it was a little bug smasher that was doing a tourist flight and turned the wrong way down the Hudson. I mean, whatever. Everyone knows little airplanes bounce off of buildings. So it's not a big deal. I mean, if you're a pedestrian, you got to kind of watch out for that. But we made some inappropriate, insensitive jokes and got back to business because it just wasn't. We didn't compute. I mean, our preconceptions did not allow us to even begin to imagine what Chunks had just seen on the television in the bar.
At Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, Captain Phil Stodick was briefing for a morning flight with a student, and like Heather, was puzzled at the need to interrupt his morning briefing.
So on the morning of the 11th, came to work just like any other day, and we were supposed to fly in the morning. So we went into our mission brief, which is typically an hour-long brief where we talk about how we're going to fly this mission, the objectives, what we need to see out of the student, what we're going to go out there and train together for the day. And we were just in the middle of that brief when the first plane hit the tower.
Right. And did you stop the brief, or what happened?
They sure did. So they knocked on the door and said, hey, there's been an incident, a plane hit the World Trade Center. And that's, in my experience at the time, it was very unusual to ever have a brief interrupted. It was kind of sacrosanct that once you're in that briefing, nobody interrupts you. It's important work. And when you get interrupted, it sometimes throws you out of your flow and can have bad consequences. So usually those briefings don't get interrupted. And so when this one did, it surprised me quite a bit. We walked out of the briefing room, looked at the TV for a little bit to see what was going on. And I was a little bit, I didn't realize the scope of what was going on, quite frankly.
Right.
And I thought that, this is a tragedy, but we've got a job to do, so we need to get back in there and brief.
While Phil and Heather went back into their morning briefings, events continued to unfold. United Airlines Flight 175, which had departed Boston Logan Airport at 8:15 with 56 passengers and 9 crew, was hijacked shortly after takeoff and crashed into the south tower of the World Trade Center at 9:03 a.m., 17 minutes after the first tower was struck. While the FAA would soon begin directing all aircraft to land, Jeff Van Dusen, Scott Lindholm, and the crew of Century 40 were not yet aware of the news and took off from Tinker Air Force Base at 9:10 a.m., just 7 minutes after the South Tower was struck.
We're late. We're running late. Climb crews out. We're probably somewhere over eastern Arkansas. And I'm sitting in the jump seat this time. So there was, Jeff's in the left seat, Vinny Lopano, co-pilot's in the right seat, Matt James is behind me, he's the navigator, and Hy Kixmiller is the other engineer. He's in the engineer seat, and I'm sitting in the jump seat. So I'm directly hunched over behind Jeff because there's really not a lot of room. And we're just cruising along, and ATC calls up and says, I think it's Memphis Center, says, hey, there's been a terrorist attack, stand by. And just silence. That's weird. And so I didn't know if Memphis Center was under attack or what. So then we hear some other people talk on every other civilian plane. It says something like, hey, did you guys hear that? I'm like, yeah, what's going on now? And it's just silence. It felt like a long time. It was probably a couple minutes, but it felt like forever. The ATC wasn't coming back.
While air traffic control personnel decided how to address the situation, Lieutenant Colonel Keith Squat Fega, the Director of Operations for the 27th Fighter Squadron at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, watched the second tower being struck live as it happened on television and took immediate action. F-15 pilot Cory Bower describes the scene at his squadron and Colonel Fega's response.
Squat was behind the desk as top three, and I remember I was just kind of in and about, and I got a phone call from a girl I was dating at the time, and she said, hey, did you see that an airplane ran into one of the World Trade Center towers? And I go, no, I didn't know that. I'll take a look at it. And in the main briefing room, we had the ability to put CNN or whatever it was on our big screen, theater screen. So somebody had already done that. And basically, right as I walked into that main briefing room was when the live video showed the second plane hitting the second tower. So we all kind of stopped, looked at each other. What I remember is Squat right over my left shoulder, right there in the doorway. He went back to the ops desk. I followed him, and his first call was to maintenance, and he told them to load the jets. And he said, find whatever missiles you can, get as many missiles on as many jets as you can. And then we started building a schedule, waiting for those first jets to get some sort of armed ordnance on them.
And at Andrews Air Force Base, F-16 pilot Heather Penney's briefing was interrupted a second time.
So when he came back the second time after the second aircraft, he said, another aircraft hit the second World Trade Center. It was on purpose. That's when we got up, went to the bar where the TV was, where the rest of the squadron was, and saw what everyone else in America was seeing that morning.
Right.
And that's when we knew our nation was under attack.
Back at Tinker Air Force Base, General Robinson's staff watched the events unfold on TV and sprang into action as well.
So we had a television there in the corner of the room, and she turns it on, and we're sitting there discussing what a bad day looks like, and we saw the second airplane hit. And every single one of us immediately said, we're under some kind of an attack here. So obviously we broke up the meeting. The Air Base Wing Commander goes over and establishes his threat response team. All the commanders went back to their respective areas. And I told my exec and my chief of staff, we need to get the senior battle staff together. So all this is happening about 8 o'clock local. By 8:15, the senior battle staff is in our command post. And the senior battle staff is the squadron commanders and the group commanders. It doesn't bring a lot of the other staff officers with it, but just that group. And I said, I think everybody in the room knows we're on some kind of an attack. And we're going to be called upon, and we're going to be called upon early, and it's going to last a long time.
While General Robinson's staff prepared for the future, Jeff Van Dusen, Scott Lindholm, and the crew of Century 40 made their decision to join the fight immediately while they were airborne.
So finally, they come back and they say, I think they said by the direction of the FAA, all aircraft are directed to land immediately. And we're all like, what is going on?
Yes. So as we're descending, I think past 20,000 feet, they said, guys, it's a terrorist. Second tower has been hit. It's a terrorist attack. At that time, I was flying the aircraft, and I just literally pushed the power off, just simultaneously. I'm like, terrorist attack? Okay.
You just heard the information and pushed the throttles up.
Yep. And started to climb. And then ATC was asking us, what are you doing? I think my whole crew was like, what's going on? I said, guys, there's a terrorist attack. We got to do our job.
So I'm looking at that, and Jeff and I are talking, and the mission crew guy and MCC's mission crew commander is calling up and talking to Jeff. And I can hear him because in the jump seat, I'm plugged into Jeff's intercom. I can hear what they're saying. And so we're all talking about it. And finally, I think we all realized when we brief this every morning, it's straight, every step briefing is that, our mission can only be changed via like a secure radio or an authenticated radio. And we all kind of like, wait a minute here. And they can't tell us to go land somewhere. The ATC can't, no matter what, they can't tell us to. And then we start heading towards the East Coast. And
as Jeff and Scott proceeded towards the New York airspace, fighter squadrons around the country started preparing for a homeland defense mission for which they had never trained. At Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., Heather explained the challenge.
So we've got two problems that we need to solve. The first problem is we need to get real missiles on board. And then the second problem is we need to get the authorization to launch. So nothing happened because we couldn't get the authorization, but immediately the leadership in the squadron jumped to and started trying to lean forward and push the rope to make things happen. So our weapons officer, Dan Raisin Kane, is calling down to the bomb dump where they keep all of our weapons. And again, for your listeners, we don't keep weapons. It's not like they're shrink wrapped and you like blow off the plastic and load it up on the jet. They're more like Legos, where you have the body of the missile and you have the fuse and you have the explosives and you've got the guidance kit, and even the fins and the rocket it all has to be put together, right?
Right.
So it's going to take time to build the missiles up. Our Director of Operations, Mark Sasseville, is trying to get hold of the Secret Service. So we're there at Andrews, which is the home of Air Force One. And anytime Air Force One moves, the Secret Service owns the airspace and the airfield. Nobody can enter the Class Delta airspace. Nobody can taxi. Nobody can take off. Nobody can land. The whole airspace is sanitized, and it's run and owned by the Secret Service. So SAS is thinking if he can get a hold of the Secret Service through the air traffic control tower, through the Andrews Tower, then maybe he can, through the Secret Service, get to the president and get us authorization to launch. Our wing commander, David Worley, is trying to go through our traditional chain of command. So he's trying to work his way up through state headquarters and the Joint Force quarters and get through the Army. And so he's trying to push the noodle through our civilian chain, our civilian chain of command. SAS is trying to end run that through the Secret Service to be able to get to the president. Our intelligence officer, David Nuts McNulty, so he's actually working with airline reservation desks. He's calling Potomac TRACON, the radar control center for the DC area. He's, so he is making literal phone calls on a landline to try to figure out and create an air order battle, so we know what airline, what flights are inbound, what flights are outbound, who's landed where, who's unaccounted for. So he's using creative open source, building us an air order battle.
While Heather's squadron was seeking authority to launch to protect the Washington, D.C. airspace, F-15s from Langley Air Force Base were preparing to join the fight as well.
And I also remember right as Squat said that, or as he hung up the phone, I heard the 2 alert F-16s because I think it was Duluth maybe, was sending an alert there at Langley, and they had been scrambled, and you could hear them scrambling right as SWAT was making that phone call to maintenance to load our, F-15s that were in a training configuration, because we were in the training mode at that time. And then we just, the chaos commenced because there was phones ringing all over and everybody jumped on a phone, and we started collecting as much information as we could.
I'd never seen anything like this in my career up to that point. And it was very, there was a process of kind of pulling who's around, who can fly missions, because the wing was not fully manned at the time. With one of the squadrons, the 71st Fighter Squadron was off at Nellis, the 27th had just returned from deployment. And so there were pilots around. They just needed to find out, hey, who can fly and who do we need to send home to get into crew rest, because I think they realized we're going to be doing probably 24-hour ops here, and who is available right now. So I said, sure, I'm available. I'm a volunteer to fly if you need me. And there was a period of...
Captain Stodick would be needed. He was chosen to fly as wingman with Lieutenant Colonel Scott Fega in the first 2 ship of F-15 Eagles that launched from Langley Air Force Base that day. As they prepared, decisions had to be made about when and how the pilots would fire upon a commercial airliner.
So the brief was quite frankly very, very quick. It was not a long process. It was just the administrative parts of the mission are going to be standard. We're going to take off and fly in standard kind of formations that we do every day. And then the main part of the brief, as you would expect, focused on what are we looking for, and when are we actually going to employ ordnance if we need to, and shoot down an airplane. And this was, quite frankly, it wasn't just a one-sided squat saying, here's what we're going to do. It was a discussion between him and I and the wing leadership there at the time on what is this going to look like, and when are you actually going to fire a missile. So that was the main part of the brief, and it was a back and forth until we kind of had a common idea of, hey, here's what we're looking for.
In the chaos of the moment, Captain Stodick and Colonel Fega would not receive the official rules of engagement, commonly known as ROE, from the Secretary of Defense on who had the authority to approve firing ordnance at a civilian aircraft until they were already on their way to fly.
It sounds bizarre. It sounds like something out of a movie, but literally, as I was climbing up the ladder to get into the jet, the intelligence officer came out and said, hey, we just got word, and here is the definitive answer on your ROE.
While fighter squadrons around the country were preparing to join the fight as fast as possible, precious minutes were passing by. American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 37 passengers and 7 crew, had departed Newark Airport at 8:42 a.m. Flight 77 was hijacked and crashed into the western side of the Pentagon at 9:37, 34 minutes after the Second World Trade Center was was struck.
So it wasn't until after the Pentagon was hit that Cheney said, aren't there fighters at Andrews? Somebody get them airborne. And we got the call from the Secret Service. But we still didn't have any missiles. So Sass looks at me and says, Lucky, you're with me. Raisin, you take Igor. You guys wait till you get missiles. Lucky, let's go. And I would love to think that Sass picked me because I was a shit hot wingman.
Heather and her flight lead would launch immediately, without weapons, devising a plan to take down an airliner on a suicide mission.
I suspect actually the reason why he picked me is because he was a senior leadership in the squadron as the DO. Our squadron commander was a part-timer. And JC Witham was on an airline trip. So Sass was a senior leadership within the squadron. Beautiful wife, incredible children, beautiful daughter, and just adorable little son. Both of them are all grown up now. But he wasn't going to let anyone else take that suicide mission. Mm-hmm. He was going to lead from the front. And I believe he selected me because I was young and single and had no family. In the time that it took to finally get the authorization, there was some downtime. And Raisin and Sass pulled Igor and me into a briefing room, and they're going to weaponeer this, right? So they're thinking through like, all right, based off of our JMEM, what's it going to take to take down an airliner? How many missiles does it take? Where's the best aim point? What can we do with our gun? How many rounds are we going to have? And if we don't, what do you do? So when we finally got the call, because we had briefed it up, we knew that this was going to be a suicide mission. Because between the two of us, we only had 210 rounds of training projectile bullets, TP rounds. They're basically like 20 millimeter BB guns. When we go into combat, as you know, you get the high explosive incendiary rounds, or like little tiny bombs, each and every one. But that's not what we had loaded up on the jets. And so Sass had 105 rounds and I had 105 rounds. And between the two of us, it wouldn't have been enough to take a jet down. Mm-hmm. So Sass was going to fly his jet into the cockpit of the airliner. And I would fly my jet into the tail, into the empennage, and take off that back half of the airliner.
In just minutes after the World Trade Center had been struck, Jeff Van Dusen and Phil Stodick disobeyed air traffic control orders to land, directing their aircraft to the eastern seaboard, knowing instinctively that their country was at war. Phil Stodick and his flight lead had briefed the tactics they would use to shoot down a commercial airliner and received rules of engagement from the Secretary of Defense on how to conduct that mission. And Heather Penney and her flight lead had devised a plan for a suicide mission to protect the Capitol from any other hostile aircraft that might be airborne. In the world of September 10th, all of these actions would have been unthinkable. For Heather, the new world, the world of September 11th, was a place she entered after seeing the second tower struck by United Flight 175.
For me, I lived in a different universe after seeing the video. You could have told me that somebody crashed in the World Trade Center and it was bad, it was a terrorist attack. But if I had not seen the images of the airliners flying into the trade centers, that was like a matrix shift, right? You were in a totally different universe after that.
I recall entering that universe, the universe of September 11th, as the Twin Towers fell. Those two symbols of American economic power and prosperity, reduced to rubble by the actions of a handful of men wielding box cutters. The Matrix may have shifted for others when they witnessed the fallen man, famously captured head down as he fell to his death, seemingly resigned to his fate. Or the couple holding hands as they fell, escaping the heat and flames of the burning towers in that brief period before the buildings collapsed. The new world of September 11th was a place where the entire world united in spirit for at least a brief period. We grieved together and resolved to respond as one in the face of evil. In the next episode of Seeking Context, we will hear about the actions of pilots Heather Penney, Phil Stodick, Cory Bower, Bobby Wolf, Jeff Van Dusen, flight engineer Scott Lindholm, and General Robinson as they are swept into the world of September 11th. Wow. That interview with Heather was conducted 2 weeks ago, but as I watched it last night and again this morning, it makes my palms sweat. Hearing her describe with such conviction and solemnity the sacrifice that she was prepared to make is a timely reminder of the sacrifices so many generations of Americans have made in pursuit of a more perfect union and a better world. The Department of Defense Code of Conduct, Article 1, which all enlistees learn in basic training and study again when they go through survival training, states that I am an American fighting in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. As we take time this weekend to reflect on those Americans lost on 9/11 and the generation of young American sailors, soldiers, Marines, and airmen called to serve in the wake of 9/11 and those lost in the wars that followed, and the lives of Iraqis and Afghans lost as well. It is my hope that we might collectively recommit ourselves to building a society worthy of those who continue to serve, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for us. I'd like to thank Caden Runnels for producing this episode. Thanks also to my guests for sharing their stories, for their service on 9/11 and in the decades that followed. Seeking Context will be back next week with part 2 of 9/10, the day before. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Twitch, or leave a review on our Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting service. I'm your host, Justin Wieland, and until then, I'll be out in the world seeking to put the events and stories of our lives in context.